play, I want to mention other performances by Second Front. I'm just using one of them, Grand Theft Avatar, as an example, in which they staged a robbery of the Linden Labs vault, and what the artists did was, in basically riffing off of the movie Face Off, they turned their own avatars into those of curators and artists. I was actually one of the people robbing Linden Labs because my face was stolen. And they then did a performance that referenced many blockbuster movies or movies from film history to develop this kind of scenario. So a very different approach in 2.0 to the staging within performative environments, largely based upon the fact that the environments themselves evolved so much. There are two documentaries I want to juxtapose here that commented and investigated these different environments. Avatara, which was done in 2003 by 536 Productions, and this was, I think, the first documentary shot in an online world, in this case On Life Traveler, which predated the virtual world of Second Life and was developed in the early 90s already. If you see this documentary, it's remarkable how people talk about the world, making a point of how community-based it is, that there are no economic interests, there's no money, there's no currency. It's really about community building. Obviously, there's also an underbelly to that, and how people lose their lives in physical space to enter these worlds. But it's very interesting to juxtapose that with Jason Spinger and Koff's Life 2.0, which looks at Second Life as an environment. And you're basically, in the comparison, struck by how commercialized the world has become, how the simulacra really has turned into a commodity in that world. And it's remarkable to juxtapose these two documentaries. Obviously, network spaces also evolve in tandem with mobile computing and are strongly connected. And there were already in the late 90s, early 2000s, projects that played out on mobile devices using the ideas of networked. An early example was James Buckhouse's TAP, which he did together with Holly Bruback. That was done for Palm Pilots, the old version of PDAs in 2002. And it's actually, I think, remarkable how sophisticated this piece was conceptually compared to some of the works we see today. What you could do here is train your little tap dancer on your mobile device. So the dancer would actually learn, going through moves in the beginning, stumble a lot, and then evolve over time. And you could actually beam moves to other people to incorporate them into dances. So it was really an evolving network. Pieces such as Scott Patterson's Marina Zirkos and Julian Bleeker's PDPEL in 2003 used, again, Palm Pilots and mobile devices to annotate the city. And then in Network Mobility 2.0, we see projects such as Blast Theory's Can You See Me Now, which already was a mixed reality game where people would play against each other on the street in a city, and virtually the runners in the street basically hunting the people that would run from them in virtual space. So a very different engagement with the mobile device in the 2.0 version. And Manifest AR's project would be another example of where mobility is moving today with augmented reality, and you can see that here within Isaiah's space. I want to move on to the idea of identity 1.0 versus identity 2.0, talking about data spaces. Obviously, those very much affect how we perform in these spaces and what the notion of identity in these spaces is. In the 90s, Sherry Turkle talked about the online distributed self that was performed in multiple windows. And what we're seeing in 2.0 is Clay Shirky's Here Comes Everybody. I don't want to suggest that Clay Shirky's book is a counterpart to Turkle's online self, but I think it nicely illustrates how the emphasis has shifted from 1.0 to 2.0. So again, looking at what we saw in the mid to late 90s, there was, for example, Keiko Suzuki, the hostess of the 7-Eleven mailing list. No images here. So Keiko was a fictional character, and ultimately people could become Keiko through the web interface. So here was a character that the public could inhabit, and that was the moderator of a mailing list. I think what made this very interesting was how coherently you still would perceive her as a character, even if you knew that Keiko was a shell that was performed by different people. It made her all the more human that different people would inhabit her, and that she wasn't a very consistent construct. In 1998, Heath Bunting created his landmark README, a bio of himself in which each and every single word is linked to the domain name that uses that word, is to is.com or .org. And it really nicely played out how identity was owned. Basically, every word in his bio here is owned by a corporation or someone else, and how presence in the web really was all about owning domain names and being visible. And then Mouchette's website, Annette Decker talked about it in her presentation yesterday a little bit. So the performance of the fictional 13-year-old Mouchette, which also got a lot of attention when Mouchette announced publicly that she would commit suicide on her 13th birthday, and that of course rendered problematic the game with online identity and what it really means. But I think we have moved into 2.0 in even more radical ways. In networked identity 2.0, we then had projects such as Zhanga's People's Portrait in 2004. Here we're moving beyond the web. People could upload their portrait to screens all over cities in different parts of the world. This was a collaboration between Ars Electronica, MAP in Singapore, and DEF. So people would have their portrait taken, and it was then distributed across these screens. Carlo Zanni did his self-portrait with Dog Project in 2008. Here his portrait is captured in Google Street View, and of course that's something that involuntarily may happen to you, and plays with the notion of the surveillance we're being exposed to constantly. What Zanni then did was submit photos to Chinese painting services that paint portraits. So you have a whole portrait series by Chinese painters that is based on the Google portrait, playing with outsourcing and with the corporate construction of identity. I also want to talk a little bit about the juxtaposition of the webcam and See You See Me in Web 1.0. In 1996, Jennifer Ringley started her webcam broadcasting site, which she saw as a straightforward document of her life. And she was considered by many people as a conceptual artist, although that wasn't necessarily her focus. Mark Tribe wrote, in websites like JennyCam, in which a young woman installed web cameras in her home to expose her everyday actions to online viewers, surveillance became a source of voyeuristic and exhibitionist excitement, and institutional surveillance and the invasion of privacy were widely explored by new media artists at the time. Tina LaPorta, in her projects such as Distance and Remote Corporealities, weaved linear remixes of webcam images from See You See Me reflector sites of people connecting online. And what LaPorta played with in these projects was particularly the delay of the transmission of the image and the text, the miscommunication in these spaces. So it was very self-reflexive, very much focused on the way of communicating that the framework enabled. When we're looking at 2.0, we have projects that deal with YouTube and chat roulette versus the earlier platforms. And I think it's very nice to look at the difference between Lonely Girl and Jennifer Ringley's JennyCam. Just looking at their personalities and how they are being depicted is already remarkable. Here is somebody who performs for a broadcasting environment. Of course, Lonely Girl 15 was exposed as a fictional site with 3 men actually behind creating this character. And I think the juxtaposition of these 2 projects very nicely illustrates the move from 1.0 and 2.0 and how we're looking at a very different way of constructing identity. And Eva and Franco Mattis's No Fun also, in a very fairly radical way, makes that point. Here, Franco Mattis staged his own hanging in chat roulette, and what you're seeing as part of the project is cycling through people looking at him, and it's sometimes quite shocking to see the response, less shocking to see the teenage girls who are really concerned about what is happening here, or people wondering if they should call the police or not, as opposed to those who just examine in a very cold way with comments such as "good for you," and that makes you wonder what kind of environment this connection creates. So distinctly different from the very poetic approach that Tina LaPorta took to See You See Me. And what I want to look at lastly is the idea of cultural production 1.0 versus 2.0. Again, I will also want to make very clear that there is no distinction, a very clear distinction between these 3 categories I'm using. Obviously, the creation of data spaces and creation of identities is a form of cultural production. So all of these different aspects very much feed into each other. So early on, we had participatory environments in Web 1.0. If you look at projects, for example, such as Andy Deck's Open Studio, created in 1999, an online environment that allowed people from all over the world to create drawings together. So basically an online